The story begins with a sense of familial duty that had weighed on my shoulders for years. It was a chilly evening when I first offered my brother and his wife financial support. They were going through a rough patch in their lives, struggling with mounting bills and facing unemployment. Seeing them in distress, I couldn't turn my back on family. I vividly remember the conversation that started it all. They had come over to my apartment, their faces worn with worry, and their voices trembling as they confided in me about their financial struggles. My brother, Jake, who had always been my closest confidant, hesitated before finally admitting that they were on the verge of losing their home. His wife, Emily, looked down at her lap, tears glistening in her eyes. It was heartbreaking to see them in such dire straits, and without a second thought, I offered my help. At that moment, I believed it would be a temporary arrangement, just until they could get back on their feet. I promised to support them with $3,000 a month, believing that I was doing the right thing. Little did I know that this decision would set the stage for years of financial strain and unmet expectations. Over time, the temporary arrangement became a silent agreement, and they grew increasingly reliant on my financial support. As I continued to work long hours to make ends meet and support my brother's family, I started to question the fairness of the situation. The initial gratitude they had shown for my support slowly morphed into a sense of entitlement, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being taken advantage of. The burden of financially supporting my brother and his wife was starting to take its toll on me, both emotionally and financially. At first, I had willingly stepped up to help them during their time of need, but as weeks turned into months and months and months into years, I began to realize that this situation was far from temporary. As the months went by, it became increasingly clear that my brother and his wife were not actively working towards becoming self-sufficient. Instead, they seemed to grow complacent, comfortable with the monthly support they received. Any attempt I made to discuss their financial independence was met with resistance or defensiveness. They would often deflect the conversation, playing on my guilt and emotions. I had my own dreams and aspirations that were put on hold as I continued to bear the financial load. Bills piled up and my savings dwindled. I knew I couldn't sustain this arrangement indefinitely, and the tension in our relationship began to mount. It was during this chapter that I started to contemplate the need for a change, realizing that if I didn't assert myself and set boundaries, I would be trapped in this financially draining situation forever. The ultimatum was beginning to take shape in my mind as I prepared to confront them about the need for a plan and an end to their financial dependence. The weight of supporting my brother and his wife had become unbearable, and I knew that I couldn't continue down this path indefinitely. Chapter 3 is a pivotal moment in the story, marking the time when I decided to take a stand and issue an ultimatum to my brother and his wife. It had been years since I first offered my financial support, believing it would be a short-term arrangement. But as time passed, the situation had become increasingly one-sided. My own dreams and financial stability were slipping away while they showed little progress towards self-sufficiency. One evening, after another heated argument about their financial dependence, I decided it was time to make my position clear. I sat them down and, with a heavy heart, told them that they had 6 months to find a way to support themselves fully. I explained that I couldn't continue to bear the financial burden and that it was time for them to take responsibility for their own lives. Their initial reaction was a mixture of shock and anger. They accused me of being heartless and unsupportive, and there were tears and raised voices. But I stood firm, explaining that this decision was not made out of cruelty, but out of necessity for my own well-being and future. Reluctantly, they agreed to the ultimatum, but the tension in our relationship hung thick in the air. I knew that the next 6 months would be a test of their commitment to change and my resolve to break free from the financial shackles I had voluntarily taken on. With the ultimatum set, the countdown to the fateful 6-month deadline began. Chapter 4 delves into the roller coaster of emotions, challenges, and changes that transpired during this critical period. In the aftermath of the ultimatum, the atmosphere in our relationship became increasingly tense. My brother and his wife were now faced with the daunting task of finding stable employment and becoming self-sufficient within a tight time frame. It was a race against the clock, and I could see fear and desperation in their eyes. They began sending out resumes, attending interviews, and exploring new job opportunities. Their efforts were evident, but the job market was unforgiving, and securing stable employment proved to be more difficult than they had anticipated. Meanwhile, I continued to provide emotional support while anxiously awaiting their progress. Our shared dinners became a mix of awkward silences and forced conversations as the looming deadline weighed heavily on all of us. The uncertainty of the situation added strain to our family dynamic, and I found myself questioning whether I had done the right thing by issuing the ultimatum. As the months passed, the pressure mounted. It was a race against time, and I couldn't help but wonder whether my brother and his wife would come through and honor our agreement. I was torn between wanting them to succeed and regain their independence and the realization that I needed to break free from the financial burden that had dominated my life for so long. Despite their best efforts to secure employment, the job market remained unforgiving, and my brother and his wife had not yet found stable jobs. The tension in our household had reached its peak, and it was clear that they were growing increasingly desperate. Instead of working together as a family to find solutions, their behavior began to change. One fateful evening, as I returned home from work, I walked into a hostile atmosphere. My brother and his wife, who had been increasingly distant in recent weeks, sat me down and delivered a shocking ultimatum of their own. They told me to get out of my own home. Their reasoning was that I was being selfish for expecting them to fend for themselves within the agreed-upon time frame. They accused me of betraying family and heartlessly disregarding their struggles. The anger and resentment in their voices were palpable, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. I had opened my home and my heart to support them during their time of need, and now they were turning against me. It was a painful and surreal moment as I realized that they had no intention of honoring the ultimatum or taking responsibility for their own lives. In the days following their unexpected demand that I leave my own home, our relationship became strained to the breaking point. It was a surreal and painful experience as I tried to make sense of their sudden change of heart. They had accused me of selfishness and betrayal, but it was clear to me that they were the ones who'd reneged on our agreement. I vacated the home I'd shared with them, feeling like a stranger in my own life. The sense of abandonment and betrayal weighed heavily on me, and I found myself questioning the foundation of our family bond. It was during this chapter that I experienced a range of emotions, from anger and resentment to profound sadness. I grappled with the knowledge that my brother and his wife had taken advantage of my generosity for years, only to turn against me when I asked for accountability. The feeling of being used and discarded like an old possession was a bitter pill to swallow. The sense of betrayal and injustice had left me seething with anger and resentment. I had been cast aside by my own family after years of supporting them both emotionally and financially. The ultimatum I had issued had been twisted, and I felt compelled to set the record straight. As I settled into a new place and tried to rebuild my life, revenge became a driving force. But it wasn't revenge in the traditional sense of causing harm or destruction. Instead, I sought a way to reveal the truth, to make my brother and his wife see the consequences of their actions and to hold them accountable for their behavior. During this chapter, I began to gather evidence of all the financial support I had provided over the years. I meticulously documented each payment, every bill I had covered, and every instance where they had relied on my generosity. It was a process of uncovering the truth and creating a compelling case to present to them. My goal was not to harm them, but to make them understand the extent of their dependence on my financial support and the sacrifices I'd made to keep them afloat. I swore on revenge, not as an act of malice, but as a means to bring about a reckoning, to shine a light on the reality they had chosen to ignore. Moving day arrived, and it was the appointed time for the revelation. I had prepared a comprehensive document that detailed every financial transaction, every bill paid, and every instance of support I had provided over the years. It was a weighty testament to the extent of their dependence on my assistance. As my brother and his wife prepared to move into their new place, I presented them with the evidence. The atmosphere was tense as they watched in disbelief as I unveiled the truth. The realization dawned on them as they saw the financial sacrifices I'd made to keep their lives afloat. Their initial reactions ranged from shock to denial, but as they pored over the documentation, their faces changed. Guilt and remorse began to creep in as they absorbed the gravity of their actions. They couldn't deny the truth any longer, and they understood the extent to which they had relied on my support. The chapter concludes with a sense of hope for a more balanced and equitable relationship with their brother and his wife, one that is free from the financial burden that had dominated their lives for so long.